The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 20th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. Jesus said, "The kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right.' So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around. And he said to them, 'Why are you standing here idle all day?' They said to him, 'Because no one has hired us.' He said to them, 'You also go into the vineyard.' When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, 'Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first.' When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought that they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, 'These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us, who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat.' But he replied to one of them, 'Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?' So the last will be first, and the first will be last." The Gospel of the Lord. So next month, I'm going to be getting together with a bunch of my college classmates to celebrate the 30th reunion of our class. Wasn't cool? And there's been this little secret private Facebook group that's been set up by a couple of my classmates, and we've all been talking about how we're going to get together and what we're going to do and everything. And as we've been having those conversations, I've been reflecting back on some of my classes and experiences and things that happened during my college years. And for some reason, one of the things that sticks in my mind is a class project that I had freshman year. It was part of an economics class, one of either micro or macro econ, I don't remember which, but it was a project in which they took us and they separated us into groups of 5 people. And the job was we were all assigned a group project. And all 5 of us would have to produce this one paper, and based on the quality of that paper, we would all get the same grade. So I don't remember what we were supposed to do or what the project was really supposed to be about, but I do remember that I worked really, really hard on that paper, along with one other person who worked really, really hard on that paper. There was a third person who did a little bit if we asked her to do it and helped out some, and there were 2 people that we couldn't find to save our lives. And so their only real contribution to the paper was really kind of to put their names on it at the end. So in the end, we ended up producing this really great paper, and we all got an A. So that was great. But the thing that I remember most about that project was what I learned was, try not to take classes where they're going to give you group projects. Because so often, in work and in school, that's how a group project goes. A bunch of people work really, really hard, a few people do a little bit, and there's always people that don't do anything at all, or it seems like they don't do anything at all. Every time that happens, and you've probably all been in those kinds of group projects at school, at work, someplace in your life, you realize it offends your sense of fairness and what's right, and you don't want to be part of it. And that is exactly why the laborers who spent all day working in the vineyard in this parable are so irritated with the landowner. Professor Landowner had given them all a group project. And in the end, they all got the same grade of 1 denarius, which is the usual day's pay, regardless of how many hours they spent working on the project. It offends their sense of what's right and their sense of what's fair. And it should. In fact, one of the reasons I think Jesus told this parable this way, and in fact he tells a lot of parables in this way, is that it shakes everybody up because it offends their ideas of the way the world is supposed to work, the way the world actually does work. It makes people go, huh? What? It can't work like that. Because in fact, if things work like this in a real vineyard, all the laborers would have learned what I learned working on that group project in econ class. You should try never to work on a group project. And if you do, there is no reason for you to show up at 6 o'clock in the morning and start working on the project. Show up at 5 because it's just as well. That's what would happen if this actually happened in a vineyard. And so, if you were the landowner, this doesn't work out well for you either. Because the next day, you're not going to be able to get anybody to work for you until the last hour of the day. But that won't really matter because after you've been paying all these people a full day's wage to work only an hour, you'll be bankrupt by the end of the week. So everybody who first heard this parable understood that this wasn't going to work. They knew that it was unfair. Everybody knew it couldn't possibly work in a real vineyard. And like many of Jesus' parables, Jesus told it in this way precisely because it flips the way the world works on its head, in order to make a point about God and about God's grace. And the point that Jesus is making is not that we should reorder how we work or how we pay people, but rather that God and God's ways work totally different than the ways that we work things, that we have to work things in our daily lives. The point of this parable is that God's grace is not fair in the way that we think of fair. God's gift of life and salvation really isn't based on how hard we work, or even if we, like Peter, have been at it from the beginning of our lives and worked really, really, really hard. Because that's the setup for this parable. It's important to know that right before today's gospel reading begins, Peter comes to Jesus and he says, literally, Lord, what's in it for us? What are we going to get? We have been working really, really hard. We've given up everything. We've left our families, our work, our home. We've been living here out on the road. What are we going to get? Aren't we going to get more because of our hard work? That's the setup for this parable. And this parable is Jesus' way of saying to his disciples, because it really is addressed to the disciples, not to the crowds. You know what? God's love and God's grace are given to you because of God and God's promise, not because of how hard you've worked for it. And that's just fundamentally unfair in the way that we think of everything else that we get in our lives. And it makes us take the way God works and turn it totally on the head of the way the world works. The point of this parable is that Jesus is saying that the goal of God is not to reward, but to include. See, this landowner is somebody who goes out and keeps inviting people into the vineyard over and over and over again. He does it at 6 a.m., which was the normal time to go and get your laborers. He goes back at 9 and 12 and 3 and 5. And as Jesus was telling this parable, all these folks who knew about how vineyards work would go, no, you don't do that. That's crazy. I mean, maybe a landowner who isn't really smart would get to 9 o'clock and go, oops, I underestimated how many people I need to work in the vineyard. And then they go out and bring some more in. But the only reason this guy can keep going out again is not because he needs the help. It's because he wants to include more and more people up to the very end, up to the point where people would say, there's no way that there would ever be an offer on the table again. That is the way God works, Jesus says. And it's totally different from the way that the world works that we always live in. And the way that God works, Jesus says, and the point of this parable is that God's generosity actually really does exceed anything we can possibly imagine. We like to imagine that we can imagine anything. But really, can you imagine that level of generosity? The ability to pay people over and over again, day in and day out, and not run out of money? I mean, how can God's love, how can God's patience, How can God's abundance really never run out? Everything I know in my life, everything you know in your life, eventually runs out. How can it not work that way with God? Jesus tells this parable in a way that says, you know what? Even though you can't imagine it, that's the way God's love works. That's the way God's call works. That's the way God's abundance works. It's unimaginable. But here's another thing. In the end, the people who were called first, the people who were hired first, weren't cheated at all. They were promised life and salvation. That's what the denarius, the full day's pay, represents. They were promised that, and they got it. They got everything that God promised them. But other people got it too. And that didn't seem fair. And I think Jesus told this parable because when we, as disciples of Jesus, when we experience God's love and God's grace and God's forgiveness in our lives, we're tempted, we want to celebrate. It's great, it's wonderful, God is generous towards us. But when we see other people getting it, we get all sort of snarky and grumpy and want to talk about what's fair. That's what Peter did. That's sometimes what we do as well. And so Jesus told this parable to say, being part of what God is doing in the world means that as individuals, we are called to live God's love in our lives every single day through our words, our actions, our attitudes, individually. But like it or not, we are called also to be part of God's group project. And God's group project works differently than any group project that we have ever been involved in work or at school. In God's group project, Jesus says we've all already got an A, and we're called to live in thankfulness and to work in thankfulness for the fact that we've already been given the gift of life and salvation. And being asked to work in response to what you already got is so different from being asked to work so that you can get something. When I was also back in college, I had professors, maybe you did too, who would begin a new class, a new semester, and they would say to us, guess what? Good news, you've all got an A right now. Don't mess it up. Right? But that's a lie. You don't have anything. You've got nothing. You've all got the potential to have an A, but you don't have it. And so don't mess it up. That's the way the world works. Jesus comes along and says, guess what? I love you. I've died for your sins. You've got life and salvation. You've got the A. Now, live in that kind of thankfulness. That's way different. And that's the hardest part for us to wrap our brains around with grace. But that is the point of this parable. That is the point of God's group project. Live and work for a different reason than trying to earn God's love. In God's group project, that's the way it works. In God's group project, the goal is actually to include more people instead of simply keeping track of our own hours or how much somebody else is working. And maybe most importantly, in God's group project, the goal also is to enter into the joy and the abundance of God's generosity. Because in the end, God's abundance and God's generosity towards us and towards others really is greater than anything any of us can imagine.